Welcome everyone to our lecture on relapse prevention and management. Hopefully you'll find this helpful for your assessment preparation. So studies have indicated to us that people generally who receive interventional treatment around SUD are likely to return or to experience a relapse to problematic use. In fact, many people have multiple episodes of abstinence and relapse. In the AOD field, some forms of relapse are considered the norm rather than the exception, though it's important to recognize that this is common with any kind of behavioral change that we're inviting clients to embark on. Now, there is a difference between a lapse and a relapse. A lapse is viewed as a slip, so to speak, whereby a client is used once or maybe several times even after having achieved the goals around their use. The quantity of drug or alcohol use involved in a lapse varies. However, it is distinct from a relapse, as a lapse occurs over a brief time and generally the client reorients themselves back to their recovery path and back to their AOD goals. In contrast, a relapse is said to occur when a client no longer maintains their focus on recovery and their therapeutic goals, and they return to their pre-treatment levels of use. If a client experienced an initial lapse, but instead of returning to their original AOD goal, and they continued using at their previous levels of AOD use, their behavior is then considered a relapse. So here's a bit of an analogy that we share with clients. Relapse prevention is like traveling down a highway that has many road signs, and these are signposts or warning signs that indicate to the client that they're approaching high-risk situations. These signposts guide the client and inform them so that they can make wise decisions. And as long as the client's willing to learn how to pay attention to these signs on purpose, they can actually prevent some, inverted commas, accidents. It's also true that not all accidents can be prevented, even with safe driving, but the driver can carry emergency supplies and prepare and plan for high-risk situations. So really our objective in terms of having conversations with our clients about relapse prevention is to help them recognize early warning signs of relapse and to develop coping skills that will reduce the risk of relapse occurring early in the counseling process when chances of success are greatest. So what we're wanting to achieve with relapse prevention is capacity building for the client and helping them to develop a bit of a toolkit with specific strategies and tools to help them navigate through different tricky high-risk situations. Now, Gorski actually gives us a bit of a model that outlines 10 phases of relapse, and I've given you a link to his discussion of these. He talks about these 10 phases that occur for people that he's observed in people that he's supported over his practice with clients in active addiction. There's a return to denial, avoidant and defensive behaviors, crisis building, which is where the client begins to experience symptoms like tunnel vision, minor depression, loss of constructive planning. Plans begin to fail the client. Then they shift to an immobilization phase in which they engage in wishful thinking. They feel a bit defeated. They just want to be happy, but they're really feeling that life is too difficult to manage. Then phase 5 is confusion and overreaction. They have periods of confusion, irritation with people, friends and family. They become easily angered. Then they shift into depression, where they might experience irregular eating habits, lack of desire to take action, irregular sleeping, loss of daily structure, periods of deep depression. Phase 7 is behavioral loss of control. So they start to miss AA meetings or support group meetings. They start to develop a defeated mindset around I don't care. Sometimes this is when clients experience those effort moments, dissatisfaction with life, and they start to generally feel that learned helplessness. Phase 8 is recognition of loss of control. So they start to engage perhaps in some self-blaming, a victim mentality starts to surface, thoughts of social drinking, some self-pity. Then they start to consciously lie or deceive loved ones, and they're losing their self-confidence around recovery. Phase 9 is option reduction. So they start to really feel resentful. They stop treatment, disengage from self-help groups. They become overwhelmingly lonely and isolated, angry and frustrated with themselves. And by this stage, they've really lost mastery of their use. And that kind of takes them into a phase 10, which is that relapse episode, where they might have an initial use, which we refer to as the lapse, that then triggers anxiety, shame and guilt, feeds into learned helplessness and hopelessness. Then the client is completely feeling out loss of control, and then, perhaps later down the road they seek out support again, and again they might be in that pre-contemplative stage or contemplative action stage of the change model. Sometimes I think it's really helpful, whilst Gorski offers us that comprehensive model, to really just conceptualize relapse as having 3 distinct types of relapses. So we're going to look at emotional, mental, then physical relapse. During emotional relapse, individuals aren't generally thinking about using. They're remembering their last relapse or lapse, and they just don't want to repeat. But their emotions and behaviours are almost setting them up for a relapse down the road. Because clients aren't consciously thinking about using during this stage, denial is a huge aspect of emotional relapse. So generally, family members, spouses, partners generally will notice risk around emotional relapse. Their loved one starts to bottle up feelings, they start to withdraw, isolate themselves, they start to internalize what's happening for them, they stop going to their meetings or counselling, they're going to meetings but not sharing, and they start to perhaps focus on others, so generally focusing on other people's problems or focusing on how other people affect them, and you start to see poor eating and sleeping habits. A common denominator of emotional relapse is, pardon me, spell check, poor self-care, in which self-care is broadly defined to include emotional, psychological, physical care. That all drops. So generally, again, it's noticed by loved ones who know the person well and their patterns. So what's an intervention goal around emotional relapse? One of the main goals of therapy at this stage is really to support the client around understanding why self-care is so important, what self-compassion means, and how they can cultivate self-compassion. So there's some really beautiful work by a Dr. Christine Neff. If you Google self-compassion, she's done a whole lot of research on self-compassion that you're able to share with your clients. The need for self-care varies from person to person. It's very subjective. And so there's this really lovely sort of model called the Holt model, which invites clients just to do a check-in with themselves maybe 3-4 times a day. So this Holt model, you would be saying to your client, at this stage, I just want you to check in with, am I hungry? Am I frustrated or angry? Am I feeling lonely or am I tired? Generally, we know that those 4 states of being are linked to emotional relapse. So we're wanting to help the client develop that ability to self-monitor and self-regulate simply by looking at that HALT model. For some individuals, self-care is as basic as physical self-care, sleep, hygiene, a healthy diet. So we're inviting clients to really keep it simple. For my clients, I ask them to consider 4 aspects during their recovery. So I ask them to feed their body well, water their body throughout the day, rest their minds and body, and move their bodies. So to engage in some level of exercise and movement. And I think because it's so simple, it's a really lovely way to get clients to start thinking about different aspects of self-care. You might ask clients questions like, are you starting to feel tired again? Do you feel that you're being good to yourself? How are you having fun? And in between my sessions, I always ask my clients to do something kind for themselves. Generally, I set that as homework, and I'm wanting to hear what kind of self-care they've been doing in between our sessions together. So there is a transition that then occurs between emotional and mental relapse. It's a natural consequence of prolonged poor self-care. Clients begin to feel restless, irritable, and generally unhappy when their self-care drops. And as their tension builds, they start to think about using as a form of coping. So either to escape or to numb some of the anxiety that's coming up strong for them. So in mental relapse, there's this war or conflict going on inside of a person's mind. Part of them wants to use, the other part of them doesn't. And as individuals go deeper into mental relapse, their cognitive resistance to relapse starts to wane and their need for escape increases. So these are some indicators of mental relapse: craving for the drugs or alcohol, thinking about people, places, things associated with past use, minimizing consequences of past use or glamorizing it, starting to do some negotiating and bargaining, even with themselves. If I have just one drink, it'll be okay, kind of talking. Starting to deceive loved ones, starting to consciously lie, thinking of schemes to better control their use, looking for relapse opportunities, so almost testing themselves out, and almost planning and moving towards relapse. So how do we intervene around mental relapse? Warning signs for this stage are when thoughts of using change in character and become insistent, compulsive. Clients are just ruminating. So there's an intensity around the compulsion to use. Helping clients avoid high-risk situations is such a critical component of your work with them. Clients have a really hard time identifying high-risk situations, believing that they are high risk in the first place. Sometimes they think that avoiding high-risk situations is almost a sign of weakness. In bargaining, individuals start to think about scenarios in which it would be acceptable to use. So people give themselves permission to use on holidays. People start to think about relapse periodically. They're switching one addictive substance for another. Occasional brief thoughts of using are normal in early recovery and are different from mental relapse. When people enter a substance use program, clients say, I want to never have to think about using again. And it can be really frightening when they discover that on occasion, those cravings and yearnings will be really strong. So normalizing these thoughts is really, really important. Often clients feel they're doing something wrong and that they're letting themselves and others down. So we need to be able to shift that shame and just normalize the fact that this might occur and to skill them up with different options. So now we're going to shift into part 2 of this